In this first video screenshot in the Crimes Course Spring 2021 for weeks 9 to 10, we're going to review or go over burdens of proof, and then we're going to identify and talk a little bit about various defenses known as affirmative defenses that can be possibly raised in New York criminal cases. And then in our next 2-week period, we're going to be talking about the defense of justification. Later on, we'll look at the defense of based on age. But for now, we're going to start with burdens of proof, and I start by saying in every criminal case in New York, the prosecution has the burden to establish beyond a reasonable doubt every element of the offense charged in the defendant's commission of the offense. And this statement would be true in all 50 states. And the reason I say that is because the United States Supreme Court in earlier decisions has held that the beyond a reasonable doubt standard is required by the Due Process Clause of the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitutions. I offer you, based on a quote from an 1897 case. I wasn't around for it, by the way, but it's just a really good definition of what reasonable doubt means. So it's got to be, it would seem to me, if we were deliberating as members of a jury in a criminal case, and I wanted to raise the position that the defendant was not guilty because the government didn't establish his or her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, I think I would be obliged to give you a reason for my doubt, not a gut feeling for my doubt, not a hunch for my doubt, not some omen that I think I recognized for the doubt, but a reason based upon a consideration of the evidence in the case. On the other hand, if someone said during deliberations, I just know the defendant did it, I can feel it in my bones, that's certainly not going to be a sufficient argument or a claim that there has been compliance with the reasonable doubt standard. The beyond the reasonable doubt standard never changes in a criminal case. What can sometimes happen, however, in New York State is that the government will have, or the people, as the prosecution is known as, will have the burden of establishing guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but the defendant may raise a defense known as an affirmative defense. And when the defendant does that, then the penal law tells us that the defendant, if the defendant is going to prevail on the affirmative defense, must establish it by a standard known as preponderance of the evidence. And the preponderance of the evidence standard, I am happy to leave this to the course on evidence, but the preponderance of the evidence standard is less demanding than beyond a reasonable doubt. The key phrase I find for preponderance of the evidence is more likely than not. So if the defendant raises an affirmative defense, and we'll be talking about some of them in this posting, then on that defense, the defendant will have the burden of proof beyond, not beyond, I apologize, by a preponderance of the evidence. If a defendant raises a defense, and self-defense is one of them, that's not listed as an affirmative defense, then we could call it just a regular defense. And if the defendant has raised a regular defense, like justification / self-defense, then the penal law tells us that the prosecution has the burden of disproving a regular defense beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't say regular defense, but I use regular defense as a parallel construction to affirmative defenses. So if the defendant has raised justification, the judge is going to say to the jury that the prosecution has the burden to establish all elements of the crime charged, and also the burden to disprove the defense beyond a reasonable doubt. On the other hand, if the defendant has raised an affirmative defense, the judge will charge the jury that the prosecution, as it always has the burden of establishing all elements of the crime charged, and if that burden is satisfied, then the jury should consider whether the defendant has met the defendant's burden of establishing, and I use entrapment as an affirmative defense, by a preponderance of the evidence. So we can take a look at, in this posting, 1, 2, 3 affirmative defenses. The first affirmative defense, popularly, I'm not saying it's popularly known means that that's what people generally call it, is the defense of insanity. Technically, under 40.15 of the Penal Law in New York, the defense is known as mental disease or defect. And again, because it's an affirmative defense, the defendant raising the defense must establish it by a preponderance of the evidence. And I think the key takeaway here is that for insanity to be a good defense for a defendant, the defendant's going to have to show that at the time the crime was committed, the defendant suffered from a mental disease or defect. And 2, because of the mental disease or defect, the defendant lacked substantial capacity to know or appreciate either the nature and consequences of such conduct or that such conduct was wrong. Oftentimes, and I'm thinking, this case came out of Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer, but the Wisconsin insanity defense is substantially like New York's insanity defense. And if you remember, Dahmer abducted young men, sodomized them, killed them, and ate them, not necessarily in that order, and raised at his trial the defense of insanity. Go figure. And when you have an insanity defense raised, then the government and the defense are going to bring in competing psychiatric evidence. And oftentimes, Dahmer's case I think might be a pretty good example. Oftentimes, most of, if not all of the psychiatrists are going to say, yeah, when this happened, the guy was suffering, insane guy, because Dahmer was suffering from a mental disease or defect. Where they will differ, however, is on the question of whether the defendant, even though he had the mental disease or defect, Dahmer, lacked substantial capacity to know what he was doing was wrong, or for that matter, to even know what he was doing. And when you look at a lot of these cases where the defense starts to get sticky for the defendant, is oftentimes the defendant will take pretty extreme steps to hide the evidence of the crime. Dahmer did that. I think the police finally got called because his neighbors were detecting a noxious odor. But Dahmer was, in his own way, trying to hide the bodies. He wasn't putting them on top of his car and driving through the streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as people do on the first day of deer season, in at least where I grew up, to show everybody they bagged a deer. And so when you have that kind of evidence, then people are going to say, seems to me, yeah, the guy may have been suffering from a mental disease or defect, but he still knew what he was doing, or why else would he have hid the conduct, or why would the mother who recently killed her children immediately call the police and say, you need to come to my house, I just did something terrible, or I just did something, I just committed murder. So insanity is not the easiest defense. Again, it's an affirmative defense, and secondly, even if you can establish mental disease or defect, you still have to show that lack of substantial capacity. And I talk about Dahmer in the notes. Another affirmative defense we could talk about is duress. And duress doesn't come up much as an affirmative defense in a criminal case for the very simple reason that it would seem to me where it does fit, most of the time there will be a prosecutorial decision or a law enforcement decision not to prosecute. In other words, if somebody goes into a gas station and puts a gun in the face of the clerk and the clerk hands over the money, it's so obvious that the clerk was under duress that no one's going to charge the clerk and make the clerk raise the defense of duress. I think where you're going to see it raised is when there's a question about the type of pressure that the defendant was subject to, or whether the defendant's story is believed. But the defense itself, again, is an affirmative defense, so the defendant must show that the defendant engaged in the prescribed conduct, meaning the conduct that would constitute the crime, because he or she was coerced to do so by the use or threatened imminent use of unlawful physical force upon the defendant or a third person. And it's the type of force or threatened force that a person, this is from the language of the statute of reasonable firmness, would not have been able to resist. So it's got to be unlawful physical force. If the defendant engages in criminal conduct because of blackmail, if you don't do this, then we're going to disclose this to the public, then that's not going to be a good defense of duress, because it's not predicated on the use or threatened imminent use of unlawful physical force. So a case that doesn't quite fit into this category, but from time to time it pops up as an historical example. Movies have been made about it, was back in there, we go again, the 1970s, a young heiress in California, Patty Hearst from the very wealthy Hearst family, was kidnapped by a small group of misfits who referred to themselves as the Symbionese Liberation Army. They put her in a closet, maybe sexually molested her. She then became a revolutionary and participated in a bank robbery. And one could have argued, she didn't, she used brainwashing, but one could have argued that what she did by participating in the bank robbery was a product of giving into the threatened force and unlawful force that had been used against her. Pretty interesting story if you ever get a chance to take a look at it. Okay, our last affirmative defense is entrapment. And I find myself rushing because I'm getting to the end of my 15 minutes, so I'm going to just put affirmative defense of entrapment in a separate, it'll be short, but a separate video, and I'm going to stop this video.